Hey everyone, in this section we will look at a shift in the aggregate supply curve. The two of the most important factors that leads to shift in the aggregate supply curve are productivity growth and change in prices. In this slide, I will show you what happens when there is a change in productivity. So let's just draw all the steps together one after the other so that the whole thing makes sense. This is my aggregate demand curve, and this one is the short run aggregate supply curve. So make sure you understand the aggregate demand curve is not changing here. Only the aggregate supply curve is changing in this diagram. So I have this aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and I will look at this point of intersection. I'm just going to name this point of intersection as E0 as per your book, and let's say the price is $10. The quantity or real gross domestic product which we have on the horizontal axis, that's also $10. Now let me use another color here and draw the long run aggregate supply curve. So this one is the long run aggregate supply curve, and this is associated with what? The long run aggregate supply curve is associated with potential gross domestic product. Now let's say there is an increase in productivity, and this is going to shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right from SRA S0 to SRA S1. The aggregate demand curve is staying the same. Now, in the long run, the production possibility frontier also changes or shifts to the right when productivity increases. As a result, the long run aggregate supply curve will also shift to the right. Let me point out another point of intersection here. I have two real gross domestic product, and I have two potential gross domestic products. So when there is an increase in productivity, what are the effects? Definitely the cause here is the short run aggregate supply curve. This is going to shift to the right when productivity goes up, as well as the long run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. I'm going to compare point E0 to E1. So point E0, the price was $10. The real gross domestic product, or I'm just gonna write real GDP, that was equal to 10. Now the new point is E1, and over here the new price is $9. The new real gross domestic product is $20. So I'm comparing points E0 to E1. I see the price went down and real gross domestic product went up. So these are the effects here when productivity increases. You can shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the right, the long run aggregate supply curve to the right again. Okay. So I'm hoping that everything is clear with the other slide. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at a rise in input prices and what happens to the short run and long run aggregate supply curve. This is my aggregate demand curve, and the aggregate demand curve is not gonna shift here because rise in input prices has something to do with the supply side of the economy, right? I have everything together. I have the aggregate demand curve, short run aggregate supply curve, the long run aggregate supply curve. Output associated with the long run aggregate supply curve is called potential gross domestic product, and the output associated with the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply, that's called real gross domestic product. So initially I have the price as $10, real gross domestic product as 10 units, maybe 10 million units. Alright, now there is an increase in input prices, and this is not gonna shift the long run aggregate supply curve, but rather it's gonna shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. So we will have another point of intersection. So let's just, okay, that's fine. I'm just gonna use this pen here. So this is 11, this is 9. So I'm gonna compare points E0 to E1. So a rise in input prices just shifted the short run aggregate supply curve to the left, but unlike the increase in productivity, it did not really shift the long run aggregate supply curve. Now looking at the effects here, E0, the price was $10, the real gross domestic product was 10. Now the new point is E1. The P1 is equal to $11 and the real gross domestic product is 9. So we have kind of a problem here because my price went up from $10 to $11. So when price goes up, the term that we use is called inflation. So let me try and write it down here. So there's too many things. So this thing is called inflation. And at the same time, you see the real gross domestic product went down from 10 units to 9 units. So this is a recession. You are paying higher prices for less amount of goods. Now, if we combine inflation and recession together, what we have is a stagflation. And this is like one of the nasty effects when the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. One of the examples from the US economy is the oil price embargo, when the price of crude oil went up and gas was really expensive and you were paying higher prices and getting less quantity. Okay, so that is all with the shift of the aggregate supply curve to the right, which we saw due to increase in productivity, and to the left, which we saw due to increase in input prices. Definitely these are not output prices. So inputs are what we need in the production process, and what we have on this vertical axis are the price of the final product. So do not really confuse the output price to the input price. Thank you very much.